January 17, 1971. Corner of 116th and 8th Avenue, Harlem. A corrupt detective stepped out of a doorway and grabbed Frank Lucas by the collar on a public street. He had been trying to shake Frank Lucas down for months. Frank Lucas looked at the hand on his collar, said 3 words, then walked away. 72 hours later, that detective was in handcuffs, his badge was gone, and his entire operation was on a table in front of federal investigators. Frank Lucas never raised his voice, never made a threat. This is what he did instead. January 17, 1971. 6:43 p.m. The corner of 116th Street and 8th Avenue, Harlem. The temperature was 11 degrees and dropping. The kind of cold that makes the city feel smaller, that pushes people into doorways and keeps conversations short and drives everyone who has somewhere to be indoors as fast as possible. Frank Lucas had somewhere to be. He was walking alone, no driver, no security, the way he often walked in Harlem because Harlem was his neighborhood and a man does not require an escort in his own neighborhood. He was wearing a dark wool overcoat, gray scarf, leather gloves. He was 3 blocks from a meeting with 2 of his distribution lieutenants and he was, characteristically, exactly on time. That was when Detective Raymond Coates stepped out of a doorway and put his hand on Frank Lucas's collar. Not on his shoulder. His collar. The specific grip of a man who has decided, before the interaction begins, that the other person's dignity is not a factor he needs to consider. Coates was 41 years old, 14 years on the force, the last 6 attached to a narcotics unit that operated in Upper Manhattan with a particular freedom that narcotics units of that era often enjoyed, which is to say, with very little oversight and a great deal of discretion about how that freedom was used. He was not a small man. 6 feet, 220 pounds, the build of someone who had learned early that physical presence was its own form of argument. He had a reputation in Harlem that was understood by everyone who operated in the neighborhood, not as a serious law enforcement officer, but as a serious collector. Envelopes, favors, information, whatever the specific transaction required. Raymond Coates was available for negotiation on most things. He had approached Frank Lucas twice before. Both times through intermediaries, both times with the specific indirection of a man who understood that certain conversations needed insulation. The message had been the same both times. A monthly arrangement. A number that Coates considered reasonable in exchange for the particular benefit of his attention being directed elsewhere. Both times, Frank Lucas had declined through the same intermediary channel, without elaboration, without counteroffer, without any indication that the conversation had registered as significant. Raymond Coates had taken this personally. What he had not done, in the weeks between the second refusal and this January evening, was think carefully about what Frank Lucas's refusal actually meant. He had interpreted it as arrogance, as the specific overconfidence of a man whose operation had grown large enough that he had stopped calculating risk correctly. He had not interpreted it as information about his own position. That failure of interpretation was about to become the defining mistake of Raymond Coates's career. He grabbed Frank Lucas's collar on a public street corner in Harlem at 6:43 in the evening, and he said, loud enough to carry, that they were going to have a conversation. That Frank Lucas had been declining to have this conversation for too long. That Raymond Coates was a patient man, but patience had a limit and the limit had been reached. Frank Lucas looked at the hand on his collar. He did not remove it. He did not pull back. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he is categorizing, filing, assigning to the correct folder in his mind for later retrieval. Then he looked at Raymond Coates. He said, very quietly, that Coates should take his hand off his collar. Coates tightened his grip. He said that Frank Lucas was not in a position to be making requests. He said that the arrangement he had proposed was more than fair and that the correct response to a fair arrangement was not silence. He said several other things, in the particular register of a man who has mistaken the power of his badge for the power of his position, who has confused the authority the city has lent him with authority that actually belongs to him. A delivery man on the opposite side of the street slowed his cart without stopping. A woman in a second-floor window above a laundromat looked down. 2 men outside a barber shop 3 doors down turned to watch without appearing to turn. A boy of perhaps 12 on a bicycle rode past and did not look at what he was seeing, which meant he saw everything. Harlem was watching. Frank Lucas said nothing further. He allowed Raymond Coates to finish what he was saying. He did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not give Coates the reaction that would have allowed Coates to escalate further. When Coates finished, Frank Lucas looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he removed the detective's hand from his collar, not with violence, with the deliberate unhurried motion of a man tidying something that has been placed incorrectly. He said he would be in touch. Then he walked away. Coates called after him once. Frank Lucas did not turn around. At 7:02 p.m., 90 minutes after Raymond Coates put his hand on Frank Lucas's collar, Frank Lucas arrived at his meeting with his 2 lieutenants. He was, despite everything, on time. He sat down. He conducted the meeting. He approved the distribution arrangements that needed approval and declined the ones that needed declining, and asked 3 questions whose answers he already knew because he always knew the answers before he asked the questions. At the end of the meeting, he said one additional thing. He said he needed everything they had on Raymond Coates. Not what they thought they had. Everything. Every envelope, every name, every transaction, every conversation anyone in their network had ever had with a man or about the man. He wanted it on his desk by morning. He said it the way he said everything. Quietly. Without emphasis. As if it were a routine administrative request. His lieutenants understood it was not a routine administrative request. What Frank Lucas's network produced over the next 18 hours was the documentary biography of Raymond Coates's second career, the one that operated beneath the career on official record. Numbers runners who had been paying Coates for protection for 4 years. A heroin distributor in Washington Heights who had been providing Coates with product in exchange for advance warning of raids. 3 separate instances in which Coates had arrested individuals and then negotiated their release in exchange for cash payments that never appeared in any departmental record. A partner, a fellow detective named Wilkins, who had been present for 2 of the 3 cash transactions and who had his own separate arrangements running parallel to Coates's. A lieutenant in the narcotics unit who had been aware of at least some of what Coates was doing and had found it more convenient to remain aware without acting. Frank Lucas read through all of it at his desk on the morning of January 18th. He read carefully, the way he read everything, making occasional notes in the margin of his own private shorthand that no one else could read. When he finished, he sat for a while without moving. Then he made 2 phone calls. The first was to a man named Arthur Webb, who worked as a paralegal at a firm on 125th Street and who, in that capacity, had developed over several years a set of relationships with certain investigators at the Department of Investigation, the city agency responsible for examining misconduct within municipal departments including the police. Webb was not an informant in any formal sense. He was a man who understood the value of information and who had learned, through his relationship with Frank Lucas, that information properly placed produced better outcomes than information hoarded. Frank Lucas told Webb that he had something that would interest his contacts at the DOI. He described, in general terms, what the something was. He said he would have materials ready for delivery by end of business. Webb said he would make the call. The second phone call was to a woman named Gloria Reeves, who ran a beauty salon on Lenox Avenue and who was, in the specific ecosystem of Harlem's information network, one of its most effective nodes. Gloria Reeves knew everyone, was trusted by everyone, and understood better than almost anyone in the neighborhood the difference between information that should travel and information that should not. Frank Lucas did not tell Gloria Reeves what had happened on the corner of 116th and 8th Avenue. He did not need to. He simply confirmed, in the oblique language that their communications always used, that the thing she had probably already heard about was accurate. Within 2 hours, every significant figure in Harlem's operational landscape knew that Raymond Coates had put his hand on Frank Lucas's collar on a public street. The reaction was not anger. Anger would have been simpler. The reaction was the specific recalibration that occurs in a community when a boundary has been crossed and everyone is waiting to see how the crossing is addressed. The men who paid Coates his monthly envelopes became suddenly uncertain about the wisdom of continuing to pay them. The heroin distributor in Washington Heights began reviewing the terms of his arrangement. The lieutenant in the narcotics unit who had been aware and inactive became aware of the possibility that awareness without action was its own form of exposure. Raymond Coates, going about his day on January 18th, noticed none of this. He was satisfied with how the previous evening had concluded. He had made his position clear. He had demonstrated that his patience had limits. He expected that within the week he would receive a communication through the usual intermediary channel indicating that Frank Lucas was prepared to discuss terms. He received no such communication. What he received instead, at 9:15 a.m. on January 19th, 51 hours after he grabbed Frank Lucas by the collar, was a phone call from his precinct commander asking him to come in. The commander's tone was the specific tone of a superior who has been given information he did not want and is now required to act on it. Coates recognized the tone. In 14 years, he had heard versions of it directed at other people. He had never heard it directed at himself. He went in. The next 6 hours were the systematic dismantling of Raymond Coates's understanding of his own position. Department of Investigation representatives were present. The materials that Arthur Webb had delivered the previous afternoon were on the table. The names, the dates, the amounts, the corroborating statements from individuals who had decided, in the past 48 hours, that their loyalty to Raymond Coates was worth considerably less than they had previously calculated. Coates tried several things in sequence. He tried denial, which lasted approximately 20 minutes before the specificity of the documentation made it untenable. He tried minimization, suggesting that the amounts involved were smaller than represented and the arrangements less formal than described. He tried the particular defense that corrupt officers of his era often tried, that everyone operated this way, that the arrangements he had made were standard practice and selectively prosecuting him was arbitrary. None of these attempts produced the result he was looking for. At 4:47 p.m. on January 19th, 72 hours and 4 minutes after he had grabbed Frank Lucas by the collar on the corner of 116th Street and 8th Avenue, Raymond Coates was placed under arrest. The charges included bribery, extortion, and official misconduct. His partner Wilkins was arrested 40 minutes later. The lieutenant who had been aware and inactive was suspended pending further investigation. Coates was processed, photographed, fingerprinted. His badge and service weapon were taken. He was walked through a corridor of the precinct he had worked in for 6 years and out through a side entrance where 2 vehicles were waiting. Several of his colleagues were present in the corridor. None of them spoke to him. He was eventually convicted on 3 of the 7 charges filed against him and sentenced to 4 years. He served 26 months. He never worked in law enforcement again. Frank Lucas was not in the precinct when Coates was arrested. He was not on the street outside. He was, according to the people who kept track of where Frank Lucas was, at a community meeting in a church on 118th Street, discussing a proposal to fund after-school programming in 3 Harlem elementary schools. He had been there since 4 o'clock. Several dozen people could place him there at exactly the moment Raymond Coates was being handcuffed. The story of what happened spread through Harlem with the specific velocity that certain stories achieve when they confirm something a community already believed. Not the operational details, those traveled more slowly and less completely. The essential fact. A detective had grabbed Frank Lucas by the collar on a public street on a Monday evening. By Thursday evening, the detective was in handcuffs. 72 hours. In the barbershops and the beauty salons and the after-hours clubs and the church steps and the back rooms where Harlem's various economies discussed their business, the 72 hours became the unit of measurement. Not because it was precise, though it was, but because it contained something true about how Frank Lucas operated. He did not react. He did not escalate. He did not reach for the most immediate available response and deploy it. He gathered, he organized, he placed, and then he waited for the machinery to complete its work. The hand that had grabbed his collar did not belong to Raymond Coates for very long after the grabbing. That was the lesson people took from it. There was one detail that traveled with the story in some versions and not others, that some people insisted was accurate and others dismissed as embellishment. It concerned the moment of Coates's arrest, specifically a message that was reportedly delivered to Coates as he was being processed. The message, in the version that included it, was 5 words. It said, "He said he would be in touch." Whether the message was actually sent, and if so by whom, and whether Coates actually received it in those words, none of this could be confirmed. But the version of the story that included it was the version that lasted. Because it sounded like Frank Lucas. Not the threat of it, not the revenge of it, but the precision. The follow-through. The particular quality of a man who says a thing and then does the thing and does not require the other person to have been paying close enough attention to understand the connection. Raymond Coates, it was said, understood the connection. He had a great deal of time, in the months that followed, to think about the corner of 116th and 8th Avenue. About the hand he had put on a collar. About the 3 seconds of eye contact that had followed. About the quiet instruction he had been given and had chosen to interpret as weakness rather than as exactly what it was. A promise. The collar he had grabbed on a Monday evening had cost him everything by Thursday. Not because Frank Lucas was the most violent man in Harlem. Not because he commanded the most soldiers or carried the most weapons or inspired the most immediate physical fear. But because Frank Lucas understood something that Raymond Coates had never learned in 14 years of operating in the city. Information, properly organized and precisely placed, is more powerful than any badge. And patience, in the hands of someone who knows how to use it, is more dangerous than any gun. Raymond Coates had put his hand on the wrong collar. He spent the rest of his life knowing exactly when he had understood that, and what the understanding had cost him. Raymond Coates spent the rest of his life knowing exactly when he understood his mistake. It was the moment Frank Lucas looked at his hand on that collar. Not with anger. with the specific attention of a man filing something away. Information, properly organized and precisely placed, is more powerful than any badge. And patience, in the hands of someone who knows how to use it, is more dangerous than any gun. If this story hit different, subscribe, hit the bell. The next one makes this look like a warm-up.